We're on week 2 in our 7-week fall series. We're working with this book called Happiness, a guide to developing life's most important skill by Matthew Ricard, who is a former scientist turned Tibetan Buddhist monk. And last week we talked a little bit about some of the misconceptions that we have in our culture about the nature of happiness, about the meaning of happiness, how we have this tendency to define it as something that's silly, frivolous. And it may seem kind of frivolous to talk about happiness in light of the different things that have been going on in the world. Last Sunday, we were just coming off the massacre in Las Vegas, and of course this week everybody's thoughts are on the wildfires that are going on, especially what's happening up in Santa Rosa and some of the areas up and down the valley, which again makes it seem kind of frivolous, right, to be talking about happiness, unless we really get a handle on how it's being defined and how we're using it in the course of this series. So let's start today with a review of the definition of happiness as it's used in this book. He says, by happiness, I mean here a deep sense of flourishing that arises from an exceptionally healthy mind. This is not a mere pleasurable feeling, a fleeting emotion or mood, but an optimal state of being. With that definition in mind, there is nothing incompatible or jarring about thinking about happiness in terms of what's going on in the world. It's the kind of attitude that we need to be cultivating so that we can deal with these kinds of events with a sense of compassion, empathy, resilience, and all the other things that keeps us moving forward in the face of what we all have to face in life. An exceptionally healthy mind. And the good news is that this exceptionally healthy mind is something that we're born with. It's something that we all have, but something gets lost on the way to adulthood. Or maybe we should say something gets added to our already exceptionally healthy mind. It gets cluttered up with these habitual, learned thought patterns that we take and we turn them into these subconscious survival strategies. So it's really a matter of having to unlearn a bunch of things, unlearn a certain way of thinking. According to Buddhist philosophy, which is the basis of this book, it's our survival strategies that cause the clinging and the aversion that bring about human suffering, according to Buddhism. We desperately try to hang on to the things that bring pleasure and approval by others, and we anxiously try to avoid and push off the things that we consider to be painful or unpleasant or earn us the disapproval of others. And before you know it, we find ourselves living the kind of lives that Henry David Thoreau described in his book Walden, where he said, "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation." Said that a long time ago, and desperation, suffering, basically the same thing. So the primary purpose of this book is to show us ways to take control of our survival strategies, our clinging, our aversion, and rediscover that exceptionally healthy mind that's there as the foundation of it all. That exceptionally healthy mind that is going to be the key to moving from mere survival to flourishing, or as we say it here at Unity of Auburn, thriving. Now, there's nothing wrong with surviving. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that we ought not survive. Survival is a wonderful thing because it sure as heck beats the alternative. But it's not enough all by itself. Sometimes it's all we have, but it's not enough all by itself. Does anyone here remember, and this is going back a few years, there used to be 2 or 3 of these wilderness survival shows on TV that used to be really popular. And I'm not sure what happened to them. You don't see them anymore. I guess they were replaced by the dancing and singing and housewives shows, reality shows, or whatever it is they're called. And I'll tell you, is that an oxymoron or what? Reality TV. Reality TV. Produced, directed, scripted. Just like real life, right? Hey, can I have my script, please? Because I'd like to see what's coming next. Does it work that way? Not a chance. But anyway, those wilderness survival shows, the one that I used to see the most was called Man vs. Wild. Man vs. Wild. And the star of the show was a guy named Bear Grylls, right? Bear, you gotta have a first name like Bear to star in a survival show, right? So every week they take this poor guy and they drop him into some horrendous wilderness survival situation. They give him a knife, a shoestring, and a toothpick. He goes for days sleeping in caves, sucking water out of tree bark, and then there's the stuff that he has to eat, which I won't go into right now. And he survives all right, but he generally comes out looking like this. Exhausted, filthy. He's crawling through a swamp in that one picture, and then down here he's getting ready to eat something that I sure wouldn't. But and you have to look at these pictures and ask yourself an important question. Are we having fun yet? Are we thriving? I'll tell you, not my idea of a good time. So I think I've made the point, right? Surviving is good, and we want to do better than that. So one of the first steps on the road to thriving that we find in chapter 4 of the book is learning how to distinguish between happiness and what he calls the imposters, or I guess he calls them the false friends. False friends or imposters. And the names of these false friends are pleasure and joy. He's not saying pleasure and joy are bad. This is all about not mistaking those things for true happiness. The exceptionally healthy mind knows that pleasure and joy have their place, but they're no substitute for happiness. And here are some of the points that the author makes about pleasure. First point he makes is that pleasure is unstable and temporary in nature. The second point he makes is that if it's repeated too often, it can turn into something unpleasant or even disgusting. And finally, pleasure is an individual experience and very often quite subjective. What is pleasure for one person may not be that for another person, and therefore it doesn't have that kind of a universal quality that we're looking for. And I think if we just take a few moments to think about it, these are intuitively apparent. Pleasure is short-lived. That's the nature of the beast. How many of us in this room have felt disappointed as we come to the end of a good book? Anyone had that experience? You get to the end of the book, you see that there's fewer and fewer pages left, and you start to anticipate the end of this great ride that we've been on, and you don't want to finish the book, but you have to, and then when you're done, it's like, okay, where am I going to find something as entertaining and great as that experience was? There you go. Pleasure, and then gone, and you're waiting for the next thing. And the second point up there about what happens when we repeat pleasurable experiences, I think we all learn this as children. Because at some point in childhood, everyone gets the chance to have too much of their favorite thing, right? And it's usually something we eat. Hey, Mom baked me a whole chocolate cake, so I'm going to eat it for every meal for the next 3 days. Sounds wonderful when you first start out, sounds great in theory, but in practice it gets old in a hurry, and by the end of a couple of days you're not so crazy about chocolate cake, at least for another week or so. And the reason this happens is again readily apparent. As the author points out, he says that pleasure is exhausted by usage, like a candle consuming itself. That's what happens. That's what happens. And finally, the last point, pleasure is personal. Not everyone derives pleasure from chocolate cake. I know that sounds deranged and unbelievable, but it's true. True happiness, as opposed to pleasure, has that universal element which doesn't depend on personal taste, or when it comes to the cake haters, the lack of personal taste. And we have to remember that there are some, truly deranged people who derive pleasure from the suffering of others. That's the way they describe it. And true happiness admits of no such thing. So those are all the reasons why pleasure is so easy to mistake and why it's an imposter, and some of the things we have to watch out for. So having said that, it doesn't mean that we have to avoid pleasurable sensations, but here's the limiting principle. Pleasures become obstacles only when they upset the mind's equilibrium and lead to an obsession with gratification or an aversion to anything that thwarts them. And that brings us to another imposter, joy. And the difference between happiness and joy is a little more subtle. Someone who radiates true inner happiness might be accurately described as joyful. That inner happiness radiates outward as something that we can only call joy. But the imposter is the kind of joy that we call elation or euphoria, which is usually caused by some sort of momentary short-term excitement, which always passes and leaves us wanting more. So here's the limiting principle when it comes to joy. Any superficial thrill that is not anchored in enduring contentment is almost invariably followed by disappointment. So that's what we want to be careful of. When we develop, or I should say, rediscover that exceptionally healthy mind that is the foundation of true happiness, there's an interesting thing that happens when it comes to pleasure and joy. We start to change the way that we experience these transitory emotions and sensations so we don't become lost, first of all, lost in anticipating what's coming, or get mired down in the disappointment that will follow when they inevitably end. We avoid that anticipation that can block us or the disappointment that can bog us down. And here's the promise. He says that a change, even a tiny one, in the way we manage our thoughts and perceive and interpret the world can significantly change our existence. We know that to be true. It's one of the foundation principles in unity. And so that brings us to the next topic, everyone's favorite, I'm sure, suffering. The Buddha is infamous for allegedly saying that life is suffering. He didn't actually say that. The problem is that, much like Jesus, nobody was transcribing his words as he spoke them, and he didn't write anything down himself. So, as we might expect, things get garbled, things get lost in translation. As best we can understand it now, what the Buddha actually said about suffering is that it is a universal and inevitable experience for humankind. And even though no one is ever in a continuous state of suffering, everyone is vulnerable to the latent suffering that is a part of existence. Vulnerable. That's the key word here. Vulnerability does not equal victimhood. You can be vulnerable, and you can still fight back, and you can bounce back. But when you take on the mantle of victimhood, that leaves us forever defeated and feeling as if we have to grovel. And unfortunately, that's the message we get from certain kinds of religion. You know, the kind I'm talking about, the ones that make us eternal victims of that thing called sin. And then they tell us, ha ha, there's nothing you can do about it. Original sin, right? Original. Is that okay? There we go. Original sin tells us that we don't deserve to be happy. We don't deserve it. But if we grovel properly in this life, we might be rewarded in the afterlife. So wait till you're dead, grovel now, happy later. No thanks. I'll take my happiness. I'll take my happiness right now, and without the groveling. Thank you. And the great wisdom teachers, including Jesus, agree. See, I don't know how anyone in their right mind could come up with something as bad, I was thinking of another word, could come up with original sin from the Gospels. I don't get it. I don't get it. The teachings of Jesus. This was the guy who reportedly said things like, I came so that you may have life and have it abundantly. He talked about joy all the time. Or he talked about how we can indeed learn how to be free from worry and anxiety like the lilies of the field. Remember that whole parable that he would tell? The message of Jesus and the other wisdom teachers is that true happiness is possible despite the pervasiveness of suffering that we see. And this is really one of the most difficult things to understand about the Buddhist concept of suffering. According to Buddhism, suffering will always exist as a universal phenomenon. But every individual has the potential for liberation from suffering to some degree at different times. It's pervasive, it's universal, because humankind will never be free from sickness, pain, old age, death, and the sense of loss and grief that we feel as a result of those things. That's a fact of life. Those things are part of the natural order, and we are part of the natural order. But just because they're part of the natural order doesn't mean that we cannot still maintain a sense of inner peace and fulfillment, that deep sense of flourishing that is the mark of true happiness. We can still maintain that despite all of those things. And of course, suffering comes to us in different forms as well. It's part of the natural order, as I've just described, but there are other kinds of suffering. There is the kind of suffering that gets inflicted by the conduct of others. The things that people do as a result of those mental toxins that we talked a little bit about last week. Things like ignorance, anger, fear, and the like. And then there's the kind of suffering that is self-inflicted. Anybody familiar with that variety of suffering? We do it to ourselves, caused by our own mental toxins, including ignorance, as well as clinging and aversion, and this inability that we have to look at reality without adding something to it or telling a story about it. And this is where we get some really good news. The process of cultivating true happiness is the antidote to all three forms of suffering. We're not going to eliminate the kind of suffering that comes from the natural order, but we can learn to face them with resilience and inner peace. Same thing when we look at the actions of other people. We can learn to face those with resilience and inner peace, even though we can't control what they do. Maybe, just maybe, if we work on ourselves, we might be an example to them, and we might change the hearts and minds of others by our example. That would be great, but we can't count on that happening all the time. And the other thing is that it's especially important to learn how to deal with our own mental toxins so that we don't become a cause of suffering for others. Then there's the self-inflicted variety of suffering, which is probably the one that we have, no, not probably, this is the one that we have the most control over, the self-inflicted kind of suffering. And here's what I'm calling the money quote for the day. He says, our inner freedom knows no limits other than those we impose on it or allow to be imposed on it. And that freedom also holds great power. It can transform an individual, allow him to nurture all of his capacities, and to live every moment of his life in utter fulfillment. When individuals change by bringing their consciousness to maturity, the world changes too, because the world is made up of individuals. That's how it works. So that brings us to another aspect of suffering. Hey, all of that sounds great when we apply it to suffering at the psychological or emotional level. But I suspect we're all wondering how that might apply to dealing with physical pain and discomfort. Well, the author uses, I think, a brilliant metaphor to help us to begin to come to terms with that. He tells us that there are two levels of experience that we're dealing with here when it comes to physical pain and discomfort. And he says we can use the ocean as a metaphor. He says there are two levels of experience here which can be compared respectively to the waves and the depths of the ocean. A storm may be raging at the surface, but the depths remain calm. The wise man always remains connected to the depths. On the other hand, he who knows only the surface and is unaware of the depths is lost when he is buffeted by the waves of suffering. We want to plumb the depths, or as I like to say here, we like to show people how to be comfortable in the deep end of the pool. And that's where we're going to pick up again next week with some practical methods for dealing with the storms that rage at the surface and plumbing the depths. So we'll see you next Sunday. Thank you.